I'll let you bring it up, Chase. Good morning. My name is Bill Swanson. I work for Stantec. We're water resources, engineering, planning company. I've been working in the Valley for a number of years. I see a lot of familiar faces here. We're doing some work in support of the blueprint through the California Water Institute to develop what's called a unified water plan for the San Joaquin Valley. This is a noble sounding goal. Let me give you a little background about what it is and why we're doing it. So many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with the settlement and the legislation around the San Joaquin River restoration. Occurred 20 years ago now. And the legislation in 2009 included a provision for the Bureau of Reclamation to provide funding to the California Water Institute at Fresno State to develop what was called the Unified Water Plan. Well, think back. That was, a long time ago. And the world sure seemed like a different place back then. And so what was important then for water planning was kind of nibbling around the edges. And most of the water planning was done through what was called regional water management plans. The funding for that was provided by the state of California. Regional groups were put together. And what they were thinking about was sustainability, but nobody was really thinking about groundwater overdraft or some of the issues. So at that time, the Reclamation thought, hey, this would be useful to at least have a look at these parts and pieces of these plans and see how can we put them together for more unified solutions for the whole of the San Joaquin Valley. Well, as they say, a lot has happened since that time. And so the Unified Water Plan as it sits today now is being developed in response to the issues that confront us today. And over the past 15 or 20 years, profound changes have occurred in the San Joaquin Valley. I've identified a few of them here. These are all things that have happened since Reclamation and legislature had the Congress had the idea to develop this plan. It's been two severe droughts. The severity and the extent of the one in 2012 to 2016 revealed some very serious problems. It revealed the vulnerability of our water supplies in the valley to changes throughout all of California. The reliance on the Delta for water supply became, the limitation on that became revealed, and unprecedented water shortages occurred throughout the valley. During the time of that drought, the legislature enacted SGMA that Jeff talked about. There's been a number of other issues that have come along, but those two factors, the exposure of how fragile, if that's the best term, our water reliability is tied to Northern California and Delta conditions, and the requirement to wean ourselves from groundwater overdraft, establishes a profound change for the valley. And so I know all of you have been reacting to incremental challenges every day, every year for most of your lives, and in particular over the past several decades. But I challenge you to think about where we are at this point in time. The sign behind me is very inspirational. The Fresno Farm Bureau was formed in 1917. That was before the Central Valley Project was authorized, let alone constructed. That was before the State Water Project was even conceived of. That was before most of the major projects that we have today existed. So try to put yourself back at that point in time. What was the vision of the community like at that point, when people were thinking about what could the future look like, what opportunities are before us? Because that's where we are today. We're back at one of those moments in time. This is not just a reaction to another issue. This is a transformational need for the valley to re-envision what does the next 100 years look like. And so we think that one of the values of the blueprint and the Unified Water Plan is to begin laying out that template. What should the future look like? So we've begun doing some work on what we call this Unified Water Plan. And we've got a document that we're preparing. It's in parts and pieces right now. Some of you in the technical committee have been providing feedback on incremental information that we've been putting out. Our goal is to get a document out for larger review early next year. The way we're organizing it is in 6 major topics. First one is why are we doing this, and I think I just explained to you why we're doing this. The next 3 talk about 3 major topics of problems: water supply / quality, flooding, and ecosystem. And so we have chapters on each of these. And there's a lot of work, by the way, that's being done by others that we're utilizing. Our intent here is not to start from scratch. There's no reason to. And frankly, while the Congress and Reclamation have been very generous in funding this, the amount of funding that's provided for this only allows us to assimilate information that already exists. There's not anywhere near the funding needed to do advancement of new work or development of detailed information on projects. It's really kind of a layout, the template, where should we go? I think the two important chapters for everyone, both in chapters 5 and 6, is what kind of projects might be out there that create solutions for the future, and chapter 6 is the big ones. What does the future look like? What kind of portfolios or visions might we embrace? So I want to talk to you a little bit about what progress we're making on all of these today, and I'll try to hit them pretty quickly. We only have a limited time, but this is really the beginning of this dialogue, so don't view this as a one and done type of conversation. It's just the beginning of the narrative. So let me begin with our water supply and demand, which I think is the kind of the cornerstone of this entire undertaking, because it drives everything we're talking about. So as Jeff had mentioned, right, the valley grew with a dependency and reliance on groundwater, which has grown into an over-reliance on groundwater that now needs to be reversed. So we think about what does the future look like. We picked a time frame of 2040. There's nothing special about 2040, other than that's the statutory time frame for Sigma compliance. Now, whether or not we get there is to be determined. Well, let's just pick that as a point in time. But if we try to keep things the way they are today, and we have the amount of water that will be available in 2040, and the changes in demands that might occur by then, how big of a gap are we dealing with? So that's what we talk about. That's what we mean when we talk about the water supply and demand gap. So there's computational work that goes into this. There's big databases behind all this. But the basic formula is somewhat simple. The changes in supply, the number one change in supply is the reduction in the amount of groundwater pumping that's tied to overdraft. That's a big number. And so we have that number. We've compiled a lot of information from all the groundwater sustainability plans throughout the entirety of the San Joaquin Valley. We've compared that with work that the Public Policy Institute, PPIC of California, has done. And we've got two different numbers. That's okay. When we add to that, then, what other changes in supply might occur? Well, we know the full implementation of the San Joaquin River Restoration Settlement will reduce the available supply to the east side of the valley. We know that whatever the outcome of the Healthy Rivers and Landscapes negotiations occurs, or whatever comes out of that process, there will be a change in the available supplies if water is dedicated for flows through rivers and delta outflow. And we know that as the climate is changing and our infrastructure doesn't, we have less ability to manage the water. All the forecasts show that future precipitation in the Central Valley might be the same quantity, roughly, that we have today, but the form will be dramatically different. Our infrastructure was designed to manage rainfall in the winter and then manage snowmelt in the spring and summer. And the snowmelt really nicely aligns with the irrigation system. So our large reservoirs tend to be like big diversion dams in April through July, where the snowmelt comes in and is moved right down the canals. The problem that we see the challenge that we see with climate change is our infrastructure is designed to manage flood flows in the wintertime tied to an expected amount of rainfall. As the climate warms, the same storms that may occur in the future that are occurring today will result in more rain and less snow. That means more sudden inflow to the reservoirs when we don't have an irrigation demand, and less snowpack later for water supply when we do need it. So a profound change is needed in thinking about how we manage the runoff from the watersheds. Similarly, the intensity of these events is becoming more concentrated, shorter duration, but greater intensity. So even more rapid runoff. And we're seeing this with these atmospheric rivers that tend to occur more and more frequently, certainly over the past couple of decades. On the demand side, there's also changes. So when we look at the groundwater sustainability plans and the intention for eliminating groundwater overdraft, that's crucial. But we also know groundwater levels oscillate, right? And so when you are operating during a series of dry years, the water levels are still going to go down because surface water supplies won't be as available. In order to sustainably manage groundwater with the normal fluctuation, the base level can't be where it is today. We can't just stop the overdraft and keep things where they are. We need to replenish the aquifers to allow that future oscillation in a way that still results in sustainable management. So some provision of water supply is needed for replenishment of the aquifers. That's a new demand. In addition, water supplies for wildlife refuges. So the Bureau of Reclamation has an obligation to acquire water for what's called level 4 or incremental level 4 for wildlife refuges throughout the San Joaquin Valley. And they've been doing that for the past 30 years under the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. But they only get a certain amount of money every year. And so they only can afford to buy so much water. And they have never been able to buy their full amount. In fact, they are significantly short in how much they can acquire. So what's ever been unmet in the past is still going to be unmet in the future. That remains a demand. But on top of that, what they've been buying in the past is still tied to a fixed amount of money. And we know that as water scarcity tightens in this valley, particularly with Sigma implementation, the demand to acquire water will go up. That means the ability for the refuge water supply program to acquire water in the future will be challenged. So even what they've been buying might be difficult to maintain. So for the purpose of an accounting process, we've said, let's look at their past purchases as also at risk, as a future demand. And then lastly, ET. Right? As the climate warms, we have longer dry periods and shorter dry periods in the summertime. We know the evapotranspiration of the existing land uses will rise. So all these go into our computations. So we end up the reduction in supply with the increase in demand, and we get what we call the projected supply-demand gap. This is a big number. As I mentioned, we have groundwater overdraft from two sources, the GSPs and the work done by the PPIC. So when we total all this up, it is a big, big number, ranging somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million acre feet per year. Maybe I'm not saying anything to you that you don't already know. You probably do recognize this. But we want everyone to understand this, right? It's good to talk among ourselves. We need to communicate to those who don't understand this and live in the valley. So the reason we did it this way, we put a range in there, rather than saying, hey, let's do a scientific study to come up with a precise number, is because it doesn't matter what the precise number is. It doesn't matter if it's 2.5 or 3 or 2.7 or 2.9 or 3.1. It's a big number. It's a really big number. And it means a lot of land would be taken out of agricultural production if all we do is reduce demand. We know that's a big problem, right? And we know that if that's just done as a reaction from a reduction in supply, and just let the market forces drive it, it will create a patchwork quilt of land retirement. It will create an unorganized economic and social framework in the valley that really should not be the desirable outcome. So one of the goals behind this unified plan and the blueprint is to say, let's chart a vision forward that doesn't result in that undesirable random outcome. So let me talk briefly about flood. So for flooding, we all know it's a big deal, right? The runoff that comes off the Sierra Nevada caused flooding in the San Joaquin Valley for as long as people have been in the San Joaquin Valley. One of the largest reasons some of these big water projects were constructed was the dual objectives of flood protection to provide protection for agricultural lands and the water supply to serve them. That's why most of these projects exist. It's a complicated system. A lot of reservoirs, lots of levees, channels, lots of agencies at the federal, state, and local level need to coordinate to make this work. And the largest bit of information that we can tap into around this already exists. It's called the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, developed by DWR, updated every 5 years. And in that plan, they've identified a number of key priorities. Number one, flood protection vision for the valley, dedicated or defined levels of flood protection for communities. Large and growing communities, 200 year or 0.5% chance of flooding at that amount in a given year. And for growing communities or smaller communities, 100 year. These are pretty ambitious goals, so they don't exist today. We know that. For technical priorities, number one priority, restore the lost capacity. We're seeing loss of flood capacity from aging and deteriorating levee systems, from land subsidence that reduces the conveyance capacity of flood channels, and other factors. And lastly, under their technical priorities, the CVFPP recognizes the same thing that we all see. There should be solutions that integrate water supply, flood protection, and ecosystem enhancement. Right? We shouldn't be looking at single-purpose solutions to multi-benefit problems. And then lastly, for authorizations and priorities for funding, what they've recognized is that a significant part of the established flood control system is no longer functioning as intended. In fact, there's almost 200 miles of levees in the San Joaquin Valley that have been deauthorized and removed from the state plan for flood protection, or state plan for flood control, and are no longer available for what's called PL 8499 disaster relief funding, because they don't meet certain standards. And so that's a diminishment of capability. So getting back to where we should be is an important priority. To make that happen, though, funding is needed. A lot of these systems protect small and disadvantaged communities. The funding capability to pay for these large, expansive systems is very limited. And so there's a need for funding for flood protection that aligns with the opportunities for water supply development. Some of the kinds of projects that we know can be developed for flood protection that have water supply enhancement opportunities are improvements in the upper watersheds. Fire protection, forest management that reduces the risk of rapid debris flow runoff after fires, healthy forests that hold water and release them at a more moderated rate reduces the inflow rates to the reservoirs. That provides benefits for flood protection, land use, ecosystem, and water supply. Diverting water from rivers during high flows, this is a big deal, right? There's a lot of opportunity for capturing or diverting water during high flow periods on the rivers throughout the valley and moving it into groundwater recharge. There's a lot of desire to do this. There are several programs the state is undertaking to try to enhance and support that. The governor signed executive orders to encourage that, directing the state board as well as actions on what level of CEQA compliance might be needed. So we want this to happen. Modified reservoir storage rules, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the concept here is to, we have fixed flood control storage space in reservoirs, but we have better science than we had when those rules were put in place in the 1940s and 1950s. We have the ability to look forward and say, we can see an event coming in, maybe we can tweak the way we're using our space to avoid flooding and maximize our water storage. Maybe move water out of the reservoir before an event, get it in the ground, create more space. Or during drier periods, maybe adapting the rules on how rapidly we need to take water out of the flood control space. Both of those provide benefits for joint flood protection and water supply. Increasing conveyance capacity of designated floodways, we talked about that already a little bit. And then lastly, additional surface water storage. Either storage on existing reservoirs, maybe a new off-channel. In particular, one idea that pops up in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is called transitory storage, dedicated or designated locations on the valley floor. It might be typical overflow lands where tules were pretty common. Rather than random flooding, have designated areas where during high flow and high flood conditions, water can be temporarily stored and then moved somewhere else, either moved into groundwater storage or moved into the conveyance systems for delivery to others. So in other words, how do we manage our flood control system to better manage our water supply? The third topic I want to talk about really briefly here is environmental resources. There's a lot of work being done to envision what might be possible. Right, so we recognize, I think we all recognize that filling this gap, this 2.5 to 3 million acre foot gap, is probably going to require a combination of solutions. Some increased water supply, but maybe some conversion of land. So when thinking about conversion of land, how do you do it, and what should you do it for? There's some great work that's been done already that highlights opportunities that demonstrate areas where there could be contiguous areas of land or corridors, if that's a good term, designated habitats, so that a more organized approach to land conversion could be applied. And so things people would think about then in developing such an ecosystem vision would be reestablishing natural processes, habitat continuity, these working lands concept where there's both economic and environmental benefits being realized from lands, and then there's a variety of habitat types that we should think about. So we want to bring this out in this plan and describe these are opportunities. We're not mapping out this is the parcel that should be converted from one thing to another. That's not the level of granularity that we're able to get to at this stage. But we're trying to lay out these concepts to begin the dialogue. So let me shift now to the second half of our document, which is to focus on the projects and the recommendations. So there's lots of sources, lots of ideas out there where opportunities or ideas for projects have already been laid out. All right, the groundwater sustainability plans, the integrated regional water management plans over the years provided lots of recommendations. The local agencies have identified even some additional ones. There's the water blueprint has identified a few. We've looked at some corridors and general cost estimates for some large canal systems. There's been concepts looked at for alternative diversion opportunities in the Delta. The federal government, through reclamation in particular, has done a number of feasibility studies that are of great value. The state of California, DWR, is doing some great work as well. They've been looking at watershed management opportunities and flood reoperation ideas, where groundwater recharge might be possible in a number of river basins. They've also been looking at a conveyance study. They've also, as part of the State Water Project, looked at the State Water Project climate adaptation strategy, saying if we look into the future, how would we adapt the State Water Project? Well, that provides valuable information that's useful, not limited only to the State Water Project, but it's valuable for all of us to look at. The CDF figures I mentioned, and the regional flood plans, and then other sources and ideas from you all. So there's a lot of ideas, a lot of places that we can think about for projects. As we think about these and look at the GSPs, one thing that rings loud and clear in the groundwater sustainability plans is the number one thing that everybody wants to do is increase groundwater recharge. So we prepared an inventory of a database of all the projects and all the GSPs in the San Joaquin Valley. And there's over 800 identified projects and management actions, of which nearly half of them are recharge projects that identify lands or conveyance or diversion opportunities to get diversion of floodwater principally. Some of it's contract water, but a lot of it's floodwater. Find places to put it into the ground where it can provide beneficial recharge to the region. Number of tactics or concepts on farm or in lieu, dedicated injection wells or dedicated basins. There's a lot of dedicated basins in Fresno. You all are familiar with that concept. Non-recharge projects, some of them are big facilities, conveyance projects and storage, some of them are management actions, some of them are demand management. And so there's a whole host of different concepts here. We're doing more filtering of the database to look with more granularity at those types. There's good information in these GSPs, and as the GSPs have been going through refinement through the review processes and some of the discussions with the state board, we've been tracking the updates and updating our database with them. So where they sit today is a little bit technical maybe for how we're presenting this, but the point I want to bring across here is that if you look at the recharge projects versus the non-recharge projects and all of these plans, there's a lot of well-defined projects. So for example, for the recharge projects, it's like 70% of them have a cost estimate and have estimated how much water supply could be recharged into the ground with them. What they don't all have is where's the water going to come from. So there's a little bit of unknown. So I want to put a little bit of a grain of salt on these numbers, in that the projects that have been identified have the capability to recharge 1.3 million acre feet per year, if we can find 1.3 million acre feet of water to put into them. So I don't want you to take away that we have the solution here. We have an opportunity for a solution, but it has to be tied to water supply. The non-recharge projects, there's a lot of great ideas there as well. Another 1.6 million acre feet of water yield opportunity if we can secure the water. And the costs are, within a reasonable, if that's the term, range. You add them all up, it's $6, $7, $10 billion. What do they say? Billion here, billion there. Before you know it, we're talking about real money. The point, though, is that you look at the scale of the economy of this now. A $5 or $10 billion investment, even if it's $15 billion investment, for a vision of what are we going to take the next 100 years. Doesn't seem like that big of a lift, but it has to be coordinated. There's a lot of detail on here, and I'm not going to walk through it in great detail for you, other than to try to demonstrate to you the level of granularity of information that we've been collecting. So as we're looking through these GSPs, as I mentioned, we have the recharge projects and non-recharge projects, and some of them have the quantified cost and yield estimates, others don't. So what we have in the, you all have these slides, what we have in the count column, what that basically means is within each one of these basins. The first number is how many of them have cost and yield. The second number is how many total projects are. And then the rest of it is what the quantities are of that cost and yield. So this is just more of a breakdown of the detail from the slide previous. I want to now conclude my discussions with how we might go forward. So as we're thinking about what should we be recommending to the state of California and to the federal government, how should we be seeking assistance from DWR, Reclamation, the Corps of Engineers, NRCS, and others? What's the story? What is the explanation of what this valley is doing to pull itself up by its bootstraps? And so one concept that we're thinking about is the way we describe this is let's start by doing everything we can ourselves. Let's start with our locally controlled projects and decision making, and that goes right back to the groundwater recharge priority. But to recharge, so that we call it portfolio one of the, think about it as a foundation, right? Foundation is do everything you can within your own control. But even that is not totally within your own control. Because some of the ability to recharge water is dependent on the ability to convey water. We have some significant problems with regional conveyance infrastructure. The Franklin Canal, the Delta Mendota Canal, the San Luis Canal, the California Aqueduct, all experience conveyance capacity restrictions because of land subsidence. These projects require modification and correction in order to support some local recharge projects that people have identified. So we've included both the local recharge emphasis and the restoration of these conveyance facilities as the first priority. The next two, you might think about them as non-structural. Actually, before I get off that first one, we know if we're talking about local supplies that exist in the valley, that's not 2.5 million acre feet. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of acre feet, less than 500, more on the order of maybe 200 or 300 at best. So we can do good things, but we can't solve the problem by only recharging local supplies. There just isn't enough local supply to do that. And when you start building projects, that the remaining water for the next project becomes less. And the frequency of that water becomes less. And so there becomes an economic breakpoint at which the implementation of groundwater recharge projects in any given basin becomes uneconomical, right? And so one thing that I think is really important to think about here is how do those decisions get made? And who makes them? So is it, again, as we talked about, we really don't want a future where land conversion is a random reaction to individuals just making their individual decisions. Uh-oh, Chase. There's some value, I believe, in looking at these projects and saying, how might they be prioritized? What's the first group of recharge projects that make the most economic sense toward achieving not just water supply, but the other objectives we talked about? And then what's next and what's next? So some help might be needed to, or even requested as part of this plan, to provide funding for either GSAs or regional groups, collectives across multiple GSAs to think about how to prioritize this. So then, what layers on top of that are some non-structural actions. This modify the operations of our reservoirs. We call it forecast-informed reservoir operations, is what I was talking about previously, kind of using the data we have, right? We've got much better data. We can forecast flows more closely, more accurately. And we now, with the development of recharge projects, we have places to put the water, right? So that all begins to hang together. On top of that, as I mentioned earlier, the moment in time that we're at is a combination of the reduction in groundwater pumping allowances and the vulnerability of the supplies because of the reliance on the Delta. And that reliance has become fragile, in part because of the operating criteria, the framework for how water can be made available for diversion from the Delta. And so the other half of the non-structural actions, let's rethink what the Delta operating criteria ought to be. The next two are big ones, right? These are the investments in new infrastructure. The fourth level there are projects that increase the movement of water within the valley. Big canal projects, south of Delta Storage, for example, this reservoir enlargement, maybe Del Puerto Reservoir, these flood basins I've talked about, the transitory storage, things of that sort, as well as large canal projects that would move water between the east and west side, say like a Trans-Valley connection off the aqueduct or a Mid-Valley connection off Mendota Pool, things of that type. Lastly then, access to more water from Northern California that can be done safely, reliably, and environmentally sustainably. So how do we connect to that? It's projects like Delta Conveyance, other modifications people are thinking about in terms of Delta diversions, north of Delta Storage. So what I want to be careful about is that we're not proposing these, that you do everything of each level first, right? I'm just describing these in terms of groupings of activities, the local activities, the non-structural, and then the big investments. So we're continuing to think through how might we present this in terms of a plan. We don't want the impression to be that we should defer the big investments until we know how much we need. We know we need them. We know that we go to the middle of that pyramid, we still have a significant gap between supply and demand. And so the questions that ultimately come about is, what is the balance between the development of additional supply versus the reduction of demand? And we don't know the answer to that. And we're not going to know it today, we're not going to know when this plan is written. But that's the question that we all need to be thinking about as we work our way through this collective decision making. So where are we going? As I mentioned, we're continuing to work on this plan, work on the documents, we'll continue to review the data sources, on projects and updating our water budgets as information is compiled. We want feedback from groups like you and others to make this plan say what it needs to say for you. This is not my report. I'm just in a role to help aggregate information. This is your report. This is a document that's intended to be your ability to communicate your needs outside of the valley. And so as I mentioned, we're trying to get to a draft, the first draft. It's not going to be perfect. I will acknowledge that before we can release it. Early next year. And so that's the pathway that we're on. We're hopeful that we can meet it, but we really, most importantly, we want input from groups like this, because this document, as I said, needs to reflect your voice more than voice. So that's the summary of my overview, Jeff. Hopefully it's time for me.